In 1951, the Kefauver Committee told the American people that organized crime in the United States had grown into something close to a government within a government. But long before those hearings reached millions of living rooms, one man had already built the system that made such a warning possible. His name was Charles Lucky Luciano, and after a bloody war in New York, he helped turn scattered gangs, neighborhood bosses, and old-world vendettas into a disciplined national machine for crime. The shocking part is not simply that Luciano became powerful. It is that he did something far more dangerous. He organized power. He created a structure designed not for chaos, but for stability, profit, arbitration, and expansion. And once that structure took hold, American organized crime would never truly operate the same way again. This is not merely the story of a gangster. It is the story of a system. A system born in crowded immigrant neighborhoods, fed by prohibition money, hardened by murder, and refined into something that later investigators, prosecutors, and historians would describe as a national criminal syndicate. If you want to understand how the American Mafia became more than a collection of local mobs, this is where the story begins. By the end of the 1920s, the underworld in New York was rich, armed, and deeply divided. The old bosses still thought in the language of villages, bloodlines, and Sicilian precedents. The younger men thought in terms of roots, supply chains, labor control, gambling, and alliances across ethnic lines. Luciano stood between those worlds, and unlike many of his rivals, he understood that the future belonged not to the loudest boss, but to the best organizer. Declassified FBI files, court records from Manhattan, and the later testimony and reporting that followed all point in the same direction. Luciano was not remembered as important simply because he was ruthless. He mattered because he helped replace improvisation with structure. Instead of endless war, he favored regulation. Instead of a single, all-powerful boss, he promoted committee rule. Instead of ethnic isolation, he worked with Jewish gangsters, such as Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel when it served business. That was the revolution. Do you think Luciano was first and foremost a gangster? Or was he something closer to an underworld executive who understood modern organization before law enforcement did? And to see how that transformation happened, we have to go back to the years when New York's underworld was not yet a corporation of crime. It was still a battlefield. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily and came to New York as a child, settling with his family on the Lower East Side. It was the classic immigrant path of the era, but Luciano's route through America went quickly into delinquency, street rackets, and gang life. Britannica notes that he was involved in mugging, shoplifting, and extortion at a young age, and later served time for selling heroin as a young man. These were not the beginnings of a future boardroom strategist. They were the beginnings of a street predator learning how power worked block by block. He came up in a city where gangs were schools of ambition. The old New York underworld was divided by neighborhood, ethnicity, and trade. Italians, Jews, Irish, and others fought, stole, and cooperated in shifting arrangements. Luciano's importance is that he learned early how to move between those worlds. The Mob Museum notes that he became involved with the 5 Points Gang and later worked for Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, while also developing ties to Arnold Rothstein, the polished gambler and fixer whose influence stretched far beyond one ethnic group. That combination mattered. Masseria represented old power. Rothstein represented modern crime as business. Luciano absorbed lessons from both. Luciano also built lasting relationships with men who did not fit the old Sicilian mold. PBS and other historical accounts emphasize his early alliance with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, a partnership that crossed ethnic lines at a time when such cooperation was still unusual in serious underworld circles. This was not sentimental friendship. It was strategic. Luciano, Lansky, and their circle understood that rigid ethnic boundaries limited opportunity. If liquor, gambling, labor, narcotics, or extortion could produce money, then partnership mattered more than heritage. That outlook would become central to the wider system later called the syndicate. Then came prohibition. For organized crime, prohibition was not merely a windfall. It was a training ground in logistics. Illegal liquor required transportation, warehouses, distribution routes, political protection, and armed enforcement. It trained criminals to think regionally rather than locally. Britannica notes that soaring bootlegging profits intensified competition among New York factions. But that same money also showed a younger generation what scale looked like. Luciano was one of those younger men. By the mid-1920s, according to the Mob Museum, he was reportedly making millions from bootlegging. That kind of money changes thinking. It teaches men to stop acting like neighborhood warlords and start acting like industrial planners. By the late 1920s, Luciano was not just a soldier. He was a broker, an earner, and a translator between old tradition and modern ambition. Britannica records that by 1925, he had become Masseria's chief lieutenant, directing bootlegging, prostitution, narcotics distribution, and other rackets. He had already seen that the real money in crime came not from sporadic theft, but from regularized revenue. Vice, liquor, gambling, labor shakedowns, and narcotics offered what legitimate businessmen would call recurring income streams. Luciano understood that if such businesses were to survive, they needed management more than theatrics. One episode from 1929, repeated in respected histories, helped build both Luciano's legend and his aura of calculation. He was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead, yet survived. Britannica describes the attack in harsh detail and notes that he never identified his assailants. Whether the motive was punishment, warning, or internal rivalry, the lesson was clear. In Luciano's world, sentiment was weakness, and survival depended on striking before others did. What made Luciano different from the old mustache Pete bosses was not that he rejected tradition entirely. He rejected tradition when it got in the way of profit. He belonged to a younger generation of mobsters who saw endless blood feuds as expensive, public, and unnecessary. The line often associated with Luciano about that era is simple and revealing. This was a business that could not keep moving if explosions went off every 2 minutes. That outlook tells us everything. Luciano was not searching for peace out of conscience. He was searching for order because disorder interrupted cash flow. When you look at Luciano's early life, do you see a born criminal or a product of an era when crime itself was becoming more organized than the law? And then New York's underworld entered the crisis that would force Luciano to choose not just a side, but a new model for how organized crime would be run. The Castellammarese War was the great break. Fought between the Masseria faction and the Castellammarese faction, led by Salvatore Maranzano, it was more than a gang war. It was a civil war inside the American Mafia. Britannica describes it as the conflict that ultimately led to the reorganization of the Mafia. That is the key phrase. Not just bloodshed, reorganization. The war was set off in 1930 after the murder of Gaetano Reina, and it escalated through a series of retaliatory killings. Advisors, lieutenants, and loyalists fell one after another. Giuseppe Morello was killed, Joe Pinzolo was killed, Manfredi Mineo and Steve Ferrigno were killed. Men crossed sides. Alliances shifted. Money was lost. Police attention increased. The old order was consuming itself in public. Luciano was officially Joe Masseria's chief lieutenant, but he had no intention of letting Masseria drag the business into permanent war. Britannica and other standard accounts agree that Luciano opened negotiations with Maranzano while still inside Masseria's camp. On the 15th of April, 1931, Masseria met Luciano at the Nuova Villa Tamaro in Coney Island. Luciano stepped away, reportedly to the restroom, and gunmen entered and killed Masseria. The names traditionally attached to the hit are Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. Whether every detail can be documented beyond later accounts, the broad fact is firmly accepted. Luciano betrayed Masseria and emerged in control of his faction. That killing was not just a betrayal. It was a management decision. Luciano had concluded that Masseria belonged to a dying order, The old man could fight, he could command loyalty, but he could not modernize. So Luciano removed him, just as a corporate board might remove a chief executive who had become a liability. That may sound cold, but cold is exactly the point. Luciano approached power without ceremony. After Massaria's death, Maranzano briefly appeared to have won. He called a meeting in Wappingers Falls, recognized the groups that would become the 5 families, and imposed a formal hierarchy of boss, underboss, lieutenants, and soldiers. In one sense, Maranzano helped codify structure. But then he made the old mistake. He declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses. Luciano had not just helped destroy one absolute ruler so he could bow to another. By September 1931, Maranzano had reportedly decided that Luciano was too ambitious to be left alive. According to the standard historical version, Luciano learned of the plot, likely through Maranzano's own circle, and struck first. On the 10th of September 1931, gunmen posing as government agents entered Maranzano's office and killed him. Britannica notes that the shooters were Jewish gunmen obtained through Meyer Lansky, men unknown to Maranzano and his guards. That detail matters because it shows Luciano using cross-ethnic alliances as a tactical advantage. Within 5 months, Luciano had helped remove both Joe Massaria and Salvatore Maranzano. 2 bosses gone. 1 war ended. 1 system discredited. And out of that vacuum, Luciano was free to offer something new. He did not simply seize a throne. He abolished the throne, at least in theory, and replaced it with a governing mechanism. That is the turning point in this story, and arguably the turning point in the history of the American Mafia. Was Luciano's greatest act of power the murder of his bosses, or the decision to make sure no single boss would ever dominate the system the same way again? Because once the war ended, Luciano moved quickly. He had not shed blood merely to win. He had shed blood to redesign the business. After the Castellammarese War, Luciano's central idea was simple and profound. No more boss of bosses. No more single autocrat whose ambition would drag the whole underworld into another ruinous war. In place of that old model, Luciano backed a ruling commission, a board of major bosses who would settle disputes, divide territories, approve major decisions, and protect the larger flow of profits. Britannica states plainly that after Maranzano's death, Luciano called together a meeting of mafia bosses who became known as the Commission, initially including the heads of the 5 families, the Buffalo Mafia, and the Chicago outfit. This is where Luciano's genius for organization really appears. He did not pretend that greed, ego, and violence could be eliminated. He simply built a framework to manage them. The commission functioned as an underworld arbitration board. If one family had a grievance with another, the problem could be reviewed, rather than immediately answered with bullets. If a boss died, succession no longer had to mean open war. If territory or rackets overlapped, there was now a mechanism to negotiate rather than merely retaliate. The Mob Museum describes Luciano as a natural organizer who continued the committee structure but refused to name himself boss of bosses. Instead, he acted more like a chairman of the board. That phrase is important. Chairman of the board is not the language of peasant vendetta. It is the language of governance, accounting, and procedure. Luciano was not becoming less criminal. He was becoming more administrative. But the commission was only one part of Luciano's redesign. The deeper change was broader cooperation across the American underworld, especially among Italian and Jewish criminal figures who had already been doing business together during Prohibition. PBS describes how Lansky, Siegel, and Luciano had crossed ethnic lines early, and how, after Prohibition, rival factions came together in what became known as the syndicate. Luciano and Lansky were among its leading bosses. This wider network was looser than the commission. It was not limited to formal mafia family governance. It was an alliance of criminal capital. To put it plainly, the commission handled mafia governance. The wider syndicate handled cooperation in money-making. The distinction matters. The commission was about rules among the Italian-American families, especially after the New York War. The so-called National Crime Syndicate was the broader practical system through which Italians, Jews, and others cooperated in gambling, bootlegging's leftovers, labor rackets, narcotics, loan sharking, vice, and, when necessary, contract enforcement. It was less a written constitution than a durable pattern of elite criminal partnership. Why did Luciano think this way? Because prohibition was ending. The black market liquor empire that had made many gangsters rich would not remain the same forever. PBS notes that with repeal approaching, the old profits weakened and rival gangs could no longer afford constant internal warfare. So they divided turf, regulated markets, and pursued new specialties: gambling, narcotics, prostitution, labor infiltration, and broader racketeering. Luciano saw that the future belonged to diversification. The machine had to survive beyond booze. The Kefauver Committee, 2 decades later, would focus heavily on interstate gambling because it recognized gambling as the lifeblood of organized crime. That is revealing. It tells us that Luciano's system worked. What had once been local vice became connected through race-wire services, layoff betting, protection networks, and regional coordination. The committee described organized crime as a nationwide network with tentacles in communities across the country. That national scale did not arise by accident. It grew because men like Luciano created a structure in which criminal enterprises could cooperate across state lines instead of sabotaging one another. What makes Luciano's master plan so formidable is that it was both conservative and innovative at the same time. Conservative because it preserved hierarchy, ritual, and discipline inside the mafia families. Innovative because it replaced personal dictatorship with collective management and expanded cooperation beyond Sicilian tradition. In other words, Luciano did not destroy the mafia. He modernized it. He also understood delegation. Luciano did not need to personally supervise every racket in every neighborhood. A modern criminal organization requires reliable lieutenants, specialized partners, and men whose talents differ. Frank Costello was political and diplomatic. Lansky was analytical and financial. Siegel could be useful in expansion and enforcement, though often volatile. Others controlled labor, waterfronts, vice, or local family operations. Luciano's role was to stand above the details enough to connect them. That is what true organizers do. They create systems other men can operate. Do you think the commission was created mainly to prevent bloodshed, or was peace simply the most efficient way to protect profits? But a structure on paper is only half the story. The real question is how Luciano's new order operated day by day, in the streets, on the docks, in the gambling rooms, in the unions, and in the quiet meetings where violence was delayed until business had been considered. At the family level, the structure was hierarchical and disciplined. Maranzano had helped formalize the hierarchy during his brief rule, and Luciano retained it because it was useful. Britannica notes that each family had, in descending order, a boss, an underboss, lieutenants, and soldiers. That structure gave the commission something to govern. Each family could manage its own internal business, but major disputes could rise to the level of the board. The day-to-day reality was less glamorous than later movies would suggest. This was administration. Meetings, messages, approvals, negotiations, collections, and careful attention to rank. A boss did not need to commit every crime personally. He needed channels. Orders moved downward. Money moved upward. Problems moved across. And everyone understood that behind every discussion stood the possibility of enforcement. Revenue came from multiple streams. By the 1930s and after, those streams included gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, vice, narcotics, extortion, and infiltration of legitimate businesses. The New York Times report on Luciano's 1,936 conviction quoted Thomas Dewey, saying that prostitution was only one of the gang's lesser rackets, and that Luciano's organization had gradually absorbed control of narcotics, policy, loan sharking, Italian lottery syndicates, receipt of stolen goods, and certain industrial rackets. That statement is revealing because it shows prosecutors already seeing Luciano's operation not as one racket, but as a diversified portfolio. One of the most important tools of national criminal coordination was information. The Kefauver Committee later emphasized the importance of interstate bookmaking and wire services. Illegal gambling depended on fast, reliable racing information moving across state lines. Whoever controlled the flow of that information controlled a vast share of illegal betting. This is why organized crime became so deeply interested in wire services, race books, and layoff systems. Luciano's generation understood that communications infrastructure was as important to gambling as trucks had been to bootlegging. Control of labor and the waterfront was another pillar. Britannica notes that during World War II, authorities sought Luciano's influence because the crime syndicate's power extended into the Longshoremen's Union. Dewey's 1946 statement, reported by the New York Times, said Luciano's aid had been sought by the armed services in inducing others to provide information concerning possible enemy attack, though the actual value of that information was not clear. Even the cautious wording is telling. Government officials believed Luciano's network could reach men on the docks and move information through channels the state itself did not fully control. Luciano's system also worked because it separated jurisdiction from cooperation. Each family had territory and interests. That reduced random collision. But the bigger earners often crossed those lines through negotiated arrangements, partnerships, or tribute. A bookmaking network might require access to information from one city, protection in another, and layoff opportunities in a third. A labor shakedown might need a political contact, a violent collector, and a compliant union official. That is where the syndicate idea mattered. Different groups kept their own identity, but cooperated where profit made cooperation rational. And what about enforcement? Luciano did not invent murder in organized crime, but he helped professionalize the conditions under which it was used. Later, writers and investigators would attach the name Murder Incorporated to a feared enforcement arm associated with national underworld interests. PBS notes that one branch of the syndicate was known as Murder Incorporated, specializing in enforcement. Here again, caution is important. It was not a corporate department with office stationery. But the principle is clear. Luciano's system relied on the idea that violence, when necessary, should serve organization, not vanity. Killing became a tool of regulation. The commission itself operated as a dispute resolution mechanism. If one family offended another, the matter could be discussed at a higher level. If a boss was too ambitious, others could combine against him. That changed the logic of power. The safest boss was no longer the most flamboyant or feared. The safest boss was the one who could earn, negotiate, and stay within the rules of the board. Luciano had taken the instincts of the corporate world and applied them to criminal sovereignty. By 1951, the American public would see fragments of this structure when the Kefauver hearings put organized crime under a national spotlight. Millions watched Frank Costello testify. The Senate history records that the hearings demonstrated how elected officials had facilitated and profited from criminal activities and helped local authorities pursue syndicates more aggressively. The underworld Luciano had helped organize had become so vast that only a public national investigation could begin to show its outlines. That is another sign of Luciano's success. His system outlived visibility. Even when its leaders were jailed, deported, or dead, the structure remained intelligible enough to continue. The boss could be removed, but the board remained. A lieutenant could fall, but the revenue stream could be reassigned. A city could face pressure, but the network could adjust elsewhere. It was resilience through organization. Which part of Luciano's system do you think made it most durable? The hierarchy inside each family, the commission above them, or the wider syndicate that crossed city and ethnic lines? And as the years passed, that system expanded into places where respectable America pretended not to see it: casinos, racebooks, unions, and international narcotics routes. Luciano's model was no longer just a New York arrangement. It had become portable. For all his brilliance as an organizer, Luciano made one mistake common to powerful men. He became too visible. The very scale of his operations drew scrutiny, and in New York, that scrutiny found its champion in Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. The Manhattan archival finding aid for Luciano's case makes clear just how serious the prosecution was. The preserved record includes police reports, grand jury minutes, wiretaps, trial transcripts, witness summaries, identification photographs, and other court records. This was no improvised case. It was a sustained legal assault on a major underworld figure. The prosecution used prostitution as the vehicle, but even Dewey made clear that vice was only part of the picture. On the 8th of June, 1936, the New York Times reported that Luciano and 8 co-defendants were convicted on all 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The article quoted Dewey as saying that prostitution was one of the gang's lesser rackets. That line is important because it reflects the state's broader view. Luciano was not simply a vice boss. He was the directing mind of a much wider criminal system. Luciano received a sentence of 30 to 50 years. According to the Mob Museum, he then turned leadership of the National Commission to Frank Costello. That transfer itself proves how well Luciano's system had been designed. Prison did not collapse the structure. The organization adapted. Orders could still move. Leadership could still be delegated. The machine did not need its architect in the room every day. Then came the war years, and one of the most controversial chapters in Luciano's life. Britannica states that after the Normandy disaster in New York Harbor, naval intelligence sought Luciano's help because the syndicate's influence reached the Longshoremen's Union. Dewey's own 1946 statement, as reported by the New York Times, said Luciano cooperated in wartime efforts to provide information concerning possible enemy attack, though the value of the information remained unclear. That caution matters. It allows us to say this much and no more. The government believed Luciano's network had enough reach that his cooperation was worth seeking. In January 1946, Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition that he be deported. The New York Times reported that if Luciano ever re-entered the United States, he would be treated as an escaped convict and required to serve his maximum sentence. Dewey described him as the leader of a syndicate that supervised and gave orders relating to a vice combine, and also noted his prior drug conviction. In other words, even in the legal paperwork of commutation, the state described Luciano not as an isolated offender, but as the head of a system. Deportation did not end Luciano's influence. The Mob Museum notes that, after returning to Italy, Luciano still maintained ties to the American Mafia as an elder statesman, and the same year traveled to Havana, where he hosted a meeting of top mobsters from major American crime families. Pressure from the United States forced Cuba to send him back to Italy, but the episode reveals that Luciano's authority had not vanished with exile. He could still convene, advise, and influence. That is the mark of a founder whose system has outlived geography. The Kefauver Committee pushed the story further. Its final report described the Mafia as worldwide in scope and stated that experienced enforcement officers believed the influx of heroin from abroad was managed by the Mafia with Charles Lucky Luciano, then in Italy, as the operating head. The report even noted that if Luciano was not the kingpin, he was certainly one of the royal family, receiving large sums of money from American gangsters and wielding influence in Mafia policy matters. This is a remarkable passage because it shows that 15 years after the Commission's birth and a decade after Luciano's conviction, federal investigators still saw him as central to high-level criminal coordination. And yet, there is irony in Luciano's legacy. The system he built to reduce destructive wars also made organized crime more efficient, more resilient, and more difficult to attack. The Kefauver hearings did not expose a chaotic underworld. They exposed a coordinated one. The committee's work helped the public understand that organized crime had political allies, business fronts, interstate mechanics, and a degree of strategy that many Americans had not fully imagined. In a sense, the hearings were a delayed public introduction to the world Luciano had helped design. His long-term impact on American organized crime is difficult to overstate. The five families remained defined by the structure consolidated after the war. The commission remained the basic governing concept. National coordination between families and allied underworld figures continued. Gambling networks spread. Las Vegas developed with major mob financing and expertise, and PBS notes that after Luciano's deportation, Meyer Lansky came to be known as chairman of the board of the National Crime Syndicate. Whether one uses that exact label or prefers the more careful language of historians, the fact remains, Luciano helped build the architecture that others would operate for decades. Do you think Luciano's exile weakened the mafia? Or did it prove that he had already built something strong enough to survive without him in America? Luciano died in Naples in 1962, reportedly of a heart attack while meeting a movie producer interested in his life story. It is a strangely fitting ending for a man whose life had become legend while he was still alive. But the real story was never just Luciano the individual. It was Luciano the organizer, the planner, the man who understood that the most dangerous criminal empire is not the loudest one, it is the one that learns how to govern itself. So, what did Lucky Luciano really do? He did not invent crime. He did not invent extortion, vice, smuggling, or murder. What he did was more consequential. He organized crime. After the Castellammarese War, he looked at a shattered underworld and saw not a kingdom to inherit, but a machine to build. He helped end the age of the self-proclaimed boss of bosses and replace it with a board. He preserved hierarchy inside the families, but created arbitration above them. He encouraged cooperation across cities and, when it paid, across ethnic lines. He turned underworld survival into underworld management. That is why declassified FBI files, court records, newspaper reports, and Senate investigations continue to return to Luciano's name. Not because he was the only gangster of his era, and not because every legend told about him is equally reliable, but because the documentary record shows his role in a turning point. He helped create a criminal order whose methods committee rule, interstate coordination, diversified rackets, delegated authority, and disciplined enforcement would define American organized crime for generations. And perhaps that is the final revelation in this story. Luciano's greatest weapon was not the gunman, it was the meeting. Not the vendetta, the agreement, not the throne, the system. In the end, the American Mafia became harder to fight precisely because it became less medieval and more modern. That was Luciano's real legacy, a criminal corporation hidden inside the shell of old-world honor. Was Luciano the most important architect of the modern mafia? Or do you think later figures like Costello and Lansky did just as much to turn his blueprint into a national system? If you found this history worth remembering, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Dark Street Files, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next documentary. And if this episode made you think, leave a comment below. Because the story of Lucky Luciano is not just about one mobster. It is about how power organizes itself, how corruption learns to speak the language of efficiency, and how America's underworld became something far more durable than a street gang. Tell us in the comments. Was Luciano a ruthless opportunist who merely profited from chaos? Or was he the man who gave chaos a structure? Did the commission prevent bloodshed, or simply make organized crime more profitable? And once a criminal system learns how to govern itself, can law enforcement ever truly catch up?